8 years of marriage should have made Emily Brooks feel secure. Instead, every passing year pushed her further into the shadows. At 33, a nurse in a Denver community hospital, she had given her heart, her time, and her loyalty to Mark. But in his family's eyes, she would never be enough. To them, she was the outsider, the one who didn't carry a prestigious title, who didn't come from wealth, who didn't belong at their polished table. They underestimated her silence, mistaking her patience for weakness. They whispered about her when they thought she wasn't listening. They dismissed her contributions, belittled her sacrifices, and reminded her, in 100 subtle ways, that she would never measure up. But what they failed to see was the storm quietly forming behind Emily's calm expression. Because a breaking point was coming. And when it did, Emily would not beg for acceptance. She would show them what happens when the woman you dismiss decides she's done playing by your rules. The evening unfolded in a polished suburban home, its dining room dressed with soft lights and expensive tableware, the kind of setting meant to radiate warmth and belonging. For Emily Brooks, it felt like anything but. She had spent the day helping her husband Mark prepare for his father's birthday celebration, quietly ensuring the wine was chilled, the decorations were set, the details aligned. It wasn't her father-in-law's smile that made her anxious. It was the subtle hostility woven into every gesture from Mark's family, hostility she had grown used to but never fully accepted. When dinner was announced, she followed the stream of relatives toward the dining table, a long polished surface arranged with steaks, side dishes, and a cake waiting at its center. But as the chairs filled, Emily's presence was treated like an afterthought. Vivian, her mother-in-law, orchestrated the seating with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Mark was directed to his place beside his sister Lindsay. Tom, her brother-in-law, sat near their father. And when Emily hovered uncertainly, Vivian made her decision loudly enough for the room to hear. "Family table is reserved," she said, almost casually, as though she were explaining the weather. Plates were placed only in front of Mark, Vivian, Tom, Lindsay, and a handful of relatives. Emily stood there with a frozen smile, waiting for the correction that never came. One uncle, noticing her empty hands, raised his brows. "Why doesn't Emily have a plate?" His question carried the tone of someone genuinely confused, not expecting cruelty to be the answer. Vivian didn't flinch. With the ease of someone who had rehearsed her disdain, she replied, "I only ordered for family." The words landed heavy, deliberate, and final. A ripple of silence followed, as if the guests didn't know whether to laugh or shrink into their chairs. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, not from shock. She had long sensed Vivian's disapproval, but from the raw sting of having it declared in public. She glanced at Mark, waiting, begging in silence for him to push back, to acknowledge her as his wife, his partner, his family. But Mark looked down at his plate, as though the marbling of a steak demanded his full attention. His silence was louder than any insult could ever be. In that moment, Emily realized something profound. Silence cuts deeper than insults. At least insults acknowledge you exist. Mark's refusal to speak for her, to even meet her eyes, was a wound she hadn't prepared for. She excused herself quietly, retreating from the table not as a wife, but as an outsider in her own marriage, aware that something inside her had shifted permanently. The humiliation was public, undeniable, and unforgettable. And it was only the beginning. In the hours after the party, Emily could not shake the weight of what had happened. She replayed every detail in her mind. The smug tilt of Vivian's voice, the quick glances between relatives, and most of all Mark's silence. But the humiliation wasn't born that evening. It was the culmination of 18 months of quiet sacrifice. Mark had once been a financial manager, a man who prided himself on his title, his suit, and the security of his paycheck. But when he lost his job after a string of mistakes, the polished image cracked. At first, Emily believed it was just a setback, something temporary. She told him she would cover things until he got back on his feet. But weeks stretched into months, and then more than a year slipped by. During that time, Emily worked relentless night shifts at the hospital, pushing her body past exhaustion. She paid the rent for their apartment, kept up with the utility bills, covered the insurance premiums, and even took on the car payment. Every necessity, every survival cost, fell on her shoulders. She carried the weight without complaint, because she thought that was what marriage meant, holding steady when the other faltered. And yet, each time they visited his family, she was reminded that her sacrifices counted for nothing in their eyes. She wasn't praised for her dedication, nor acknowledged for keeping their lives afloat. Instead, she was diminished, dismissed as though her role were irrelevant. Still, Emily endured it with quiet grace, repeating to herself that patience would change things. If she kept showing loyalty, surely they would see her worth. But the party shattered that belief. Watching Mark sit silently, unwilling to defend her even when she was openly excluded, cut deeper than any of Vivian's insults. Emily realized it wasn't just Vivian's hostility she had been tolerating, it was Mark's complicity. His silence wasn't neutral, it was agreement. And in that moment, patience no longer felt like strength. It felt like surrender. As she sat alone later that night, she let herself face the truth she had long avoided. She had been carrying not just the bills, but the relationship itself. Mark's lack of work, his lack of defense, his lack of courage, it all rested on her shoulders. And the cost wasn't just financial. It was her dignity, her identity, her sense of belonging. Sometimes, she thought, you don't reach a breaking point. Sometimes the breaking point finds you. That night, it found her, sharp, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Something inside her cracked open, and from that fracture, a new clarity began to form. The woman who walked into that party wasn't the same as the one who walked out. The tension in the dining room was suffocating, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Emily's chest rose and fell as she steadied herself, her eyes locked on Mark. For 8 years she had swallowed her words, convinced herself silence was strength. But in that moment, she could no longer carry it. She stood slowly, her chair scraping against the polished floor, pulling every gaze toward her. Her voice trembled at first, but the words carried a force stronger than fear. She looked directly at her husband and asked, "Am I family to you?" The question cut through the room, sharper than any knife on the table. Mark's face drained of color, his lips parting but forming no defense. He mumbled weakly, urging her not to make a scene, but the request was the final insult. Emily's heart pounded, but clarity guided her. "A scene," she repeated, her tone steady now, her courage crystallized. "The real scene is this. For over a year, you haven't had a job. Every bill, every rent payment, every insurance premium I've covered with 12-hour night shifts. And through it all, your family treated me like I was nothing." Her words didn't rise in anger, they landed in truth, undeniable and unflinching. The room fell into a stunned silence. Forks were set down. Glasses remained untouched. The illusion of control that Vivian had always held over family gatherings fractured in an instant. Mark's silence, once her shield of denial, was now exposed as proof of his weakness. Emily's hands did not shake as she reached into her bag. She had prepared for this day long before the party. From the envelope, she drew out crisp documents, the divorce papers drafted with her lawyer. She placed them on the table, not with drama, but with a deliberate calmness. "This," she said, "is me choosing not to wait any longer." Vivian gasped, her composure cracking, and rushed to reframe the narrative. "How dare you humiliate this family?" she spat, her words laced with venom. "You're making a fool of Mark, of all of us. No decent woman would air private matters in public." Her attempt to redirect the shame onto Emily was swift, but this time it faltered. From the far side of the table, a voice rose. Aunt Sharon, who had watched silently through the years, finally spoke. "No," she said firmly, her tone slicing through the tension. "Respect isn't optional. She's given everything, and all she's received in return is scorn. She deserved better long ago." Heads turned toward her, some nodding faintly, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Vivian tried to interject, but her authority had already slipped. For the first time, the unchallenged hierarchy at the family table was disrupted. Emily had forced the truth into the open, and no one could unhear it. Emily looked around one last time, her eyes scanning faces that had smirked at her silence for years. This time, she didn't lower her gaze. She gathered her bag, her voice even but resolute. "I've carried enough." Without another word, she walked away from the table, her footsteps steady, her back unbowed. The weight she had borne for so long seemed to lift as she reached the door. For the first time in years, she wasn't shrinking to fit into their version of family. She was stepping fully into her own. And as the door closed behind her, Emily carried with her not just the sting of betrayal, but the fire of newfound confidence, the beginning of a life on her terms. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Within days of the party, whispers turned into full conversations across the extended family. What had once been unspoken now traveled like wildfire. The story spread not as gossip, but as a revelation long overdue. Emily's years of quiet sacrifice had finally surfaced, and with it came the unraveling of the facade Vivian had carefully maintained. Lindsay, who had once looked down on Emily with smug superiority, found herself abruptly uninvited from a cousin's wedding. The excuse given was polite, but the message was clear. Her loyalty to Vivian and her cruelty toward Emily had cost her. Vivian herself faced the sharpest blow. For decades, she had ruled family gatherings with an iron grip of judgment, but now eyes turned cold when she entered a room. Relatives who once tolerated her sharp tongue began to avoid her altogether. Respect, once commanded, was quietly withdrawn. Mark tried to salvage the situation. To anyone who would listen, he downplayed the confrontation. "It was just a fight," he muttered, as though the implosion of his marriage could be reduced to a minor spat. But the hollow words fooled no one. The image of him sitting silent while Emily carried the weight of their life had already taken root. He was no longer a man under pressure. He was exposed as a man who had abandoned responsibility. Meanwhile, Emily stepped into a new chapter with quiet determination. She packed her belongings, moved into a small but sunlit apartment, and for the first time in years felt space to breathe. The walls of her new home were bare, but they carried no echoes of contempt, no reminders of the nights she spent covering for someone else's failures. They were hers, empty, yes, but filled with possibility. The legal process began quickly. At the mediation table, Emily sat poised, her documents neatly organized. She had kept every record, receipts, bank statements, utility bills, each one a testament to her endurance. With calm precision, she slid them across the table. "These are the payments I made," she stated, her voice steady. Mark leaned back, shaking his head in disbelief, his only defense a repeated refrain. "I can't believe you did this to me." The words sounded less like accusation and more like a plea for a reality that no longer existed. Emily looked at him, not with anger, but with clarity sharpened by 18 months of exhaustion and sacrifice. "No," she said firmly, "you did this to me." It was not shouted. It was not cruel. It was simply the truth, undeniable and final. In that moment, the imbalance of their marriage revealed itself in stark relief. He had lived cushioned by excuses, while she had lived shackled by burdens. Now, with the evidence laid bare, the chains had broken. From her own perspective, Emily understood something profound. "The truth doesn't just free you," she reflected silently. "It reveals who was really trapped in lies." And as she left the mediation that day, documents in hand, Emily realized she was no longer defined by survival. She was defined by choice, her own at last. A month later, Emily's life looked nothing like the one she had left behind. The heaviness of her old apartment had been replaced by light streaming into her new space. She had just accepted a promotion to nurse supervisor, a role that not only recognized her years of dedication but also came with a well-earned salary increase. For the first time in years, she wasn't only paying bills, she was building toward something of her own. She stood on the balcony of her soon-to-be home, a small but sunlit apartment with space for the plants she had always dreamed of tending. The greenery, she imagined, wasn't just decoration, it was a symbol of growth, of resilience, of her life taking root again. Mark's story unraveled in an entirely different direction. With the divorce papers underway and no job to anchor him, he returned to his parents' house, once again shielded by the walls of comfort that had enabled his avoidance of responsibility. He complained, he deflected, he mourned his losses loudly to anyone who would listen. But for Emily, his words no longer carried weight. His voice had become background noise in a life she no longer inhabited. She had no energy left to spend on the man who once consumed all of hers. Vivian, too, could not escape the consequences. The woman who once prided herself on control now found herself forced into an unfamiliar role: silence. Her carefully curated authority had fractured when relatives chose distance over deference. She attempted to reach out with a vague, almost performative apology in an email, but Emily read it once, closed the screen, and never replied. Some bridges, she realized, were not meant to be rebuilt. In quiet moments, Emily reflected on the journey that had led her here. She knew the lessons had been costly, but they were hers to keep. She understood now that respect could not be begged or bargained for. It had to begin with her own self-respect. She had once thought patience would change others, but she now knew patience without boundaries only invited harm. Her reflections distilled into truths she carried forward. Respect yourself first. Without it, others will never learn to. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are survival, and without them, dignity is lost piece by piece. And most of all, silence should never cost more than your dignity. She had once paid that price, but never again. As she stood in her new apartment, imagining the balcony blooming with green, Emily felt a quiet pride. She was no longer waiting for acceptance, no longer holding her breath for approval. She had reclaimed her voice, her place, her future. And she left her audience with a question, one that lingered long after her own story paused. Have you ever been treated like an outsider in your own family? What would you do to reclaim your place?